Sometimes you need a little bit of wisdom in your life, and when I do, I call Rabbi Brad Hirschfield. Rabbi Hirschfield is the president of CLAL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. He's also written a number of books, has appeared on television, and he's here today to talk to us about doctors and patients. So, how are you?
I'm great and really grateful for this opportunity. This is about the most important topic in the world, and to be able to talk about it is a privilege, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And I know we've talked a little bit about, specifically we've talked about oaths, because I'm a lawyer and I had to take an oath to be a lawyer. And I tried a case last week and it occurred to me, something I see them do all the time, but jurors actually have to take an oath to be jurors. Did you have to take an oath to be a rabbi?
I actually did and I didn't. I know, it's a very rabbinic answer. So there's no formal oath in that way, and yet I take an oath every morning as part of my prayer practice, because there's a covenant that I reaffirm every day between God as I understand God, between God and the world, between God and me, between me and humanity. What are we really called to do? That the world is fundamentally good and that we have a role to play. And so that's part of my worship every single morning. And so in that sense, I didn't take an oath to become a rabbi. I take an oath every day to become more human.
Well, and that's an interesting thing, because the difference between a formal oath, whether or not that's even necessary, we can talk about, and just the idea that you take that moment, whether it be at the beginning of a relationship or the beginning of your day, to say, I'm here, I'm present, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. One of the things that's sort of big in medicine right now is the oath that doctors have to take, because it used to be the Hippocratic oath. And it's so interesting, I went back to look at it. First of all, people think the Hippocratic oath says do no harm, when it truly doesn't say that.
Right.
What it does address is issues like paying back your teachers if they need money.
Right.
And also abortion, assisted suicide. I mean, a whole lot of things that perhaps aren't so applicable. So there's been a trend towards different oaths for doctors. What do you think about that?
I think there's an advantage and a disadvantage. Look, the idea that you're saying something that's been said for 2,500 years has a real power. And that's why, for me, it's not just informal in the morning in my personal practice. It's part of a set liturgy. And the Hippocratic Oath is a kind of medical liturgy. The oath, I don't know what oath you swore, but also my guess is it wasn't one made up real recently.
That's right.
So there is a power of saying, I stand here today reciting words that my forebears have said for 2,500 years. That's the value of tradition in general. On the other hand, at some point, tradition feels like there's nothing there for you. And that's when you do need to innovate, and you do need to generate, and you do need to create. So I think the fact that rather than walking away from the old because it doesn't work, people are reinventing, is perfect. Because what I know has to happen is if you're going to do something as important as practice medicine, it better be in light of something larger. And that's what every oath-taking moment is about. It situates the immediate action as part of some larger story, some bigger ethical commitment, some greater human sensitivity. And I don't know about you, but that's the kind of doctor I want in my life.
Without a doubt. And I think that some of the more recent oaths really get to the kernel of that. There's an oath by Dr. Louis Lasagna, who is the dean at Tufts. And among the many things that those medical students vow to do is to be warm, to have understanding, to have sympathy. And those, as you said, that's the humanity that people really crave in their doctors. You know, recently, and you and I talked about this morning, there was an article in the New York Times, a gentleman named Paul DeMarco, I think, or Peter DeMarco, wrote a letter to the doctors and nurses who cared for his wife. And we talked about how that letter really reflects those instances of warmth, sympathy, and understanding. You brought up a good point, which is that it sort of depends on the person receiving those things, how they're received. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, we're in a partnership with our healthcare providers no matter what. And the Peter DeMarco story is perfect because he wrote this magnificent letter, and we should be clear, his wife died. And it's important to note that you can experience profound gratitude alongside profound loss. It's not either or. The genius for me is if it had been a happy outcome, I actually wouldn't have been as moved by the story, which is my own limitations, I'm sure, because gratitude is always good. But it's easy to understand gratitude when what you hoped would have happened occurred. This guy is heartbroken. His life is forever changed. So the love of his young life, they were young people, and she died. And he still found the capacity to be grateful for the small and large acts of humanity that he experienced. And what I'd said to you is that's as much a tribute to him as to his caregivers. Because when he writes something like, you know, you came into the room when I was sobbing and holding her hand, and you tried to make yourselves as unobtrusive as possible. He could have said, why the heck did you come into the room when I was sitting there with her? In other words, he had the heart of a grateful receiving recipient. And as a result, he interpreted those acts, he metabolized those acts in a healthier way. And that's just a small example. Every piece of his letter could have been spun, if he wanted to be angry, as a shortcoming of the doctor. Why did you have to give me bad news at all? I only wanted good news. Instead, it was, look, I know there was bad news. You gave it graciously and honestly and lovingly, and that means so much to me. And so what I loved about it was that this is an absolutely clear-eyed, unflinching, in the moment of tragedy, taking responsibility for, I can internalize the good that's happening to me alongside the horror that's happening to me.
Well, and I'm going to include that article in the show notes because I think that that's something that people should really read. I don't know that everyone would be capable of that type of emotion and gratitude.
I don't know that I would be.
No.
That's why I think it's so moving, because this guy is now, even though I've never met him, he is now my teacher in how to be a better patient and family member.
Well, and that's the thing, too. When we talk about this, it really is relationships, and mainly the relationship between patient and doctor, but it encompasses the social support for both parties, for the doctor and for the patient. Now, one thing that I have thought about, although my mother this morning told me that it was an absolutely ridiculous notion, is whether patients should consider, if not taking an oath, at least being aware of their part in the relationship and their responsibilities in the relationship going into the doctor-patient relationship. What do you think about that?
So with great trepidation, I'm going to argue with your mom.
Oh, dear.
I think it's a brilliant idea. I think it's a necessary idea. And I think that the more options we have as patients, and we do have more than ever before, even more than a generation ago, with every set of increased options come increased obligations. The idea that we would take an oath, that we would be clear about what our commitments as patients are, to work in partnership with our healthcare providers who need that partnership, especially because there is so much more, and it's not always easy. I had a conversation, without getting into too many weird details, with my doctor just a couple weeks ago, and he wouldn't give me what I want was a straight answer. And I was like, how can they? And I realized, no, he's doing something much more important. He patiently laid out, to the best of his ability, a whole range of options and the medical science behind it, and said, I would tell you if one was the clear path. There isn't a clear path. And so his honesty was immediately dissatisfying, and then more profoundly really satisfying, because I realized I had a role here. And I could be a choice maker. And how many people often feel, especially with their health, that it's out of their hands, it's out of our control. And in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. A patient oath returns us to the place of partnership in self-care that is a crucial piece of getting healthy or staying healthy.
Well, and I think that there are a lot of hurdles to overcome to really get to where we accept that. Because I've spoken to a lot of doctors lately who say that patients want an answer. They lay out the options, and the patient really says, well, what would you do?
Right.
Because they want the educated answer. And I think that there's an absolute need for patients to have someone who says something with confidence and leads you down a certain path. At the same time, it is completely up to us to educate ourselves. One of the things that I think has been a real growth in medicine is patients coming up with ideas. There's a lot of websites where patients talk to one another, and as a result of what they say, medicine changes. Do you think if you were to envision, maybe not an oath, Mom, but some
No,
sort
go for
of
the oath. You're so right. It would raise the game for every patient if we actually did take some kind of oath. Imagine you get up in the morning, and before you go to the doctor or you're sitting in the waiting room, what are the 2 or 3 lines that you're going to say to pledge yourself to being the kind of patient you want to be so you can get the health care you most want?
Well, and that's, and what would it be? What types of things would you put forward as you're sitting there waiting to speak to your doctor as you were a couple weeks ago?
So I would say the first thing is honest. Promise that you will be honest and candid, first with yourself about what you most want, and then with your doctor or nurse or PA or whatever it is. Be real, and it's not easy, because most people I know say, well, if I just fudge it a little bit. Yeah, but that won't get you the result you want. So the first thing is be really honest.
And I think but I'm going to interrupt you there
Yeah.
because I think that doctors and PAs and nurses would be so grateful for that because it's very difficult for them to know what you're not telling them.
Right. They
And
can
then
only
can't
work with
treat it.
what
That's right.
information that we give them so they know what to go. It's very hard to find what you don't know you're looking for.
That's right. Your eyes
And
can't see what your mind doesn't know.
Right. So
Yeah.
we've got to be honest with, again, first with ourselves. And that may be the hardest thing of all in life in general, and especially with healthcare. Be clear with yourself. What do you really want at this moment? And tell them that. And be clear about that. And then be honest with them about whatever's going on. Right? That's the first thing. The second thing is be curious. Be inquisitive. Ask lots of questions. You can do it respectfully. The truth is, our desire to get that clear answer, and I'm just like that, I would say to the doctor, what would you do? And I think a doctor can and should say what they would do, and then remind us, but you're not me.
Right. Right.
So now you know what I would do for me, but we're not the same person. What do you want to do in light of what I've told you? So being curious is really important. It's not just about getting downloaded on by your healthcare partner. Ask questions. But ask questions from a place of respectful partnership. Right? I think it's very important that patients talk to each other and be educated. I think it's also really important to appreciate the person you're talking to. This is what they've invested their entire professional identity in. And so there's a line between being annoying and being inquisitive. And I think being inquisitive is crucial. Being annoying actually won't work. So now, honesty, inquisitiveness, and then I think be appreciative. I think the capacity to be grateful for the care we're getting actually invites greater caregiving
Just
and
like
also
anything
helps
else.
us to feel so much better about it. So those are the three I would start with.
Yeah, the curious one is really interesting because I do think that there's often times where people come in and they've checked with Dr. Google and they really think that they already know what they want. And they might be right, but I think that you can't be married to that idea because the doctors, the nurses, the PAs, the midwives, they have an education that you can't get from Dr. Google.
That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that I'd add to that as well is to write it down. You know, I think that that's another thing that when these healthcare conversations are stressful, scary, sad, confusing. And so to be able to document it, both your questions and the answers, I think is a huge help.
Yeah, I think it's very, very important to do. It's an organized kind of process. It brings some seriousness to it, and it's absolutely worth doing. Write it down for sure.
And the appreciative thing, I mean, listen, it's a relationship. You know, I always say that this is a team, and one member of the team has to be appreciative of the other member of the team and the part that they play, because without everybody playing their parts, you're never going to move the ball down the field, to bring that analogy home. And I think that that's what both the patient and the doctor ultimately want.
Absolutely. You're not, if it's, we're going to torture this a little bit more, I guess, right? You are not a spectator
That's right.
in your own health care. And if you imagine yourself to be one, I promise you, you're not going to get the health care you most want. Play whatever role you want on the team, but understand you're one crucial member. You need the rest of the team. Treat them accordingly, and put yourself into the game accordingly.
Yeah, and I think that if both patients and doctors were to honor that approach, maybe not an oath, but that approach every time that they interact, I do think that our healthcare would improve, and I do think that our health would improve, which is ultimately the goal.
Right. I think that's right, and I think the oath-taking piece is important. That's why I really do think some kind of an oath, it reminds us we're part of something larger at that moment. And I think that's really important, right? That you're not going in to be treated just for that bump or that ouch or that, right? You're a person. Right. And you want both the doctor to remember that you're a whole person, and you want to remember that you're a whole person. And if you go in accordingly, it makes a big difference. But it's a funny thing, because remembering doesn't just happen. In order to remember, it helps to have a practice on a regular basis. So whether that's an oath or a meditation or a reading or something you write down every time fresh, it actually doesn't matter. But you don't just remember by accident. Memory happens because it's cultivated and nurtured. If we want the doctors to remember they're treating whole people, they need a practice to remind them of that. If we want to remember that we're partners in our health care, we need a practice for that. I'm not telling people what it should be, but have one, and it's amazing that having a practice to remember, you won't have to worry about remembering because you're never going to forget.
Well, Brad, I'm probably going to ask you to come back and remind us of these things a little bit more, if that's okay.
I would love that.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.